Hi, I'm Jonica Newby. Welcome to Catalyst.
In Science News tonight, a new computer virus attacks and a black hole at the centre of our galaxy. Jonica Newby reports on how our brains change with trauma.
We're about to see the biggest outbreak of post-traumatic stress disorder seen in the Western world since the last war.
Graham Phillips checks out offences against alien microbes.
If the Martian microbes accidentally escape, could they wreak havoc on Earth?
And Gail Jennings' final report into Coma, the miracles.
We see how individual stories can dramatically challenge the accepted medical wisdom in brain injury and rehabilitation.
Hello, I'm Karina Kelly. Tonight, Catalyst begins with two special reports on the terrorist attacks in America. We'll bring you the latest research on trauma, what happens when we go from disbelief to grief and beyond. But first, the World Trade Center. Catalyst investigates how an American icon could be reduced to a pile of steel and rubble so easily. When the World Trade Center was built in 1973, its twin towers were the tallest buildings in the world. Part of their revolutionary new design made them resistant to strong winds and allowed for huge open office spaces. Their strength depended on a steel shell. But no skyscraper in the world is designed to withstand this.
The steel loses strength and stiffness as its temperature increases past about 1500 degrees. The ferocity of that fire would have been well and truly enough to push that steel past its elastic limit, if you like, and it would have started to soften and yield.
Dr. Andy Davids is one of a handful of people who designs the world's tallest buildings. He's a structural engineer and a friend of Les Robertson, who engineered the World Trade Center.
It's that top 25 stories is dropping. You can see clearly on the footage that that top 25 levels moves almost as a rigid object, a single block. It rotates over quite a long way, actually several metres, and drops as a single object. The mass of debris just keeps feeding upon itself as it drives down the building, and the building just basically unzips.
So was the lightness of the steel frame a fatal flaw?
The failure was due to the consuming nature of the fire and how that weakened the steel structure. And I think it's not possible to design a structure that's failure-proof.
Yet, 56 years ago, a near neighbour of the World Trade Center withstood another aerial attack. On the 18th of July 1945, a B-25 bomber flew into the Empire State Building in heavy fog.
And that's the limit of the damage, really, quite a small hole, perhaps 10 metres in diameter. That was a much smaller aircraft. It was a World War II bomber, and it weighed about 10 tonnes as compared to the 767, I understand, that hit the World Trade Center buildings, which weighed probably the order of 100 to 150 tonnes.
So 10 times bigger.
10 times bigger.
But the Empire State Building is still standing today. Why is that?
Yes, it is. The structural system of the Empire State is similar in one way to the World Trade Center in that it's a steel frame. However, on the Empire State, those steel frame beams and columns, they've all been infilled with heavy masonry panels.
Does that mean the Empire State Building was a better made building because it could withstand this plane crashing into the side of it?
Man-made objects such as buildings are evaluated on many criteria. The striking of a fully loaded aircraft was not one of those criteria.
But how would more modern buildings cope with a plane slamming into them?
The buildings that we design today are probably not much better in that regard. That buildings, by their nature, require support along the perimeter and also in the centre. I think the main difference is that the more modern high-rise buildings that we design and build today tend to have a large, solid, reinforced concrete core in the centre, which is the main stability element, which prevents the building from moving in response to wind and earthquake and impacts such as from aircraft.
So if you have a core of reinforced concrete, then a collapse like that wouldn't happen?
I wouldn't say it wouldn't happen, because I think the actual collapse was due to the fire, in fact, rather than the aircraft impact. So I think if we were to learn any lessons from this tragedy, it would be that the control of massive fires in buildings really needs to be reconsidered.
With the world still struggling to comprehend the US terrorist attacks, Jonica Newby explores what lies ahead for those who have to deal with the trauma.
It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building.
There was smoke everywhere and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
Oh, shit! Oh, shit, they're jumping! They're jumping! Oh, shit!
In the last 9 days, the world has watched in horror at the images on their television screen. But imagine what it must have been like to have been there, to be just walking down a busy city street like this one, look up and see an aeroplane slamming into the side of a building. The shock must have been extraordinary, and many experts believe we're about to see the biggest outbreak of post-traumatic stress disorder seen in the Western world since the last war.
There will be many people in New York. This is obviously one of the most densely populated areas in the world who would be out looking at this. People in the building obviously at a particularly high risk. And above and beyond them, you've got all the emergency service workers. You know, we may be talking of 1 million people who could have been potentially at risk in this situation.
Research after other disasters suggests 20% of the people at risk will go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder.
20% of 1 million is 200,000 people. I mean, this is not an insignificant issue.
You okay, officer?
Severe post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, interferes with every facet of daily life. Sufferers are anxious, have difficulty in relationships, and have poor short-term memory. And it's not a case of just pulling themselves together. Sandy McFarlane and his colleagues at Flinders University are about to publish findings that for the first time reveal exactly how post-traumatic stress disorder disrupts normal functioning of the brain.
When you see someone who suffers from PTSD, the one thing they say to you is that I just can't seem to keep things in my mind. I can't seem to sustain my attention on things keep dropping out, my memory keeps dropping out. And what we seem to have found is the area of the brain that is crucial for controlling that.
What they've found is something very wrong with the left frontal area of the brain. The left frontal area seems to control what we hold in our conscious minds, our working memory. To do this, it must coordinate flawlessly with 3 other key areas of the brain. But as the team have just shown, in PTSD sufferers, the left frontal area is badly misfiring.
It's like a car, when the timing is off, it chugs along, it still gets there, but it's much slower and less efficient at doing that. And so in a sense, when dealing with everyday things, people who suffer from PTSD have their timing out, so to speak. And many people who do suffer this disorder talk about the effort they have to put in to do everyday tasks.
And there are other intriguing brain effects, because the left frontal also processes language.
The language areas in the brain actually are not working in a normal way. We could characterise people's response as speechless terror. And I think it's one of the reasons why war veterans often remain silent in their distress and don't share it with other people, because there isn't a world of easily shared language that allows people to talk about these things. The interesting thing is that these neuroimaging studies really demonstrate that there is an underlying neurobiology to that.
What we need to do now is get a better
So
idea
how do you
about
predict which people will go on to develop these disturbing symptoms? In the last few years, Richard Bryant has identified the signs.
I'm edgy, I'm jumpy, I can't sit still. Things like emotional numbing, where I just don't respond emotionally to things that I normally would respond to. A sense of reliving the experience. And by that I just don't mean a memory. I mean like I feel I'm actually going through it again. I actually see the images and I actually have the sensations as if it's all happening again. And elevated heart rate in the week after a traumatic event tends to be associated with people who, further down the track, will develop post-traumatic stress disorder.
to see how I'm going.
Early prediction is important because the longer treatment is left, the worse the prognosis.
Essentially, with cognitive behaviour therapy provided in the first month after an event, about 80% of those people who had otherwise developed PTSD seem to recover.
Yet in the short term, many won't seek help. The full extent of the problem will only emerge later, when some people realise they're not recovering from their distress.
This will begin to emerge 12 to 18 months after the event. And the trouble is, everybody is overwhelmed by what's occurred. One of the classic things that happens after disasters is that the media gets tired of it. There begins to be a sense that these people are somehow alienating themselves from life, and why don't they just get up and get on with it? So, and often governments have new concerns and initiatives to pursue. And one of the major things that you have to do is anticipate that that's going to occur right now, and set systems in place to ensure that that doesn't occur.
Oh my God, there it goes!
From this week, the symptoms of those heading for post-traumatic stress disorder will begin to become apparent. Can systems be set in place to stop 200,000 New Yorkers going down this traumatic track?
Making science news this week, a computer virus is spreading like wildfire across the internet. Called NIMDA, admin spelt backwards, the virus attacks PCs and systems using Microsoft Windows 2000. Infected emails arrive without a subject line and contain an attachment titled readme.exe. The virus suspended National Australia Bank's internet and telephone banking services for most of yesterday and is expected to cause even more damage than the Code Red virus, which cost $5 billion to eradicate. Australian researchers have found the Y chromosome responsible for maleness has shrunk dramatically in the last 100 million years and is still shrinking. The Y chromosome contains genes needed for male sexual development, sperm production and stature. But the researchers say men shouldn't worry.
Men have nothing to fear because there will always be some mechanism to make you a man and do the functions that the Y chromosome do. Otherwise there'd be no men and there'd be no humans.
An immense flare in the centre of the Milky Way has provided the strongest evidence yet that a black hole with a mass of 3 million suns lies at the heart of our galaxy. The observation shows a flare of X-rays believed to be produced when matter is swallowed up by the massive gravitational pull of the black hole. And on Sunday morning, our time, NASA's veteran explorer, Deep Space One, will take on its riskiest mission yet, intersecting with a comet. It will pass just 2,000 kilometres from the nucleus of Comet Borrelly to study its surface and surrounding gases. But the probe wasn't designed for this mission and won't be protected from comet debris travelling at nearly 60,000 kilometres an hour. It could need a lot of luck. And that's science news for this week. Next up, Graham Phillips looks at the possibility of invasion by Martians.
Here's something to think about. What if it turns out there is life on Mars? NASA's planning to bring rock and soil samples back from the red planet. If the Martian microbes accidentally escape, could they wreak havoc on Earth?
Microorganisms that could be harmful are a real possible threat.
Yes, it's very possible that it could be dangerous if we're directly exposed to it, just as something like Ebola is if you're exposed to that, or smallpox. So we have to treat it carefully.
No, I'll just stick with the water.
Even NASA's John Rummel is aware of the risk. His official title is Planetary Protection Officer, and part of his job is to make sure Martian bugs don't escape from samples brought back to Earth.
But I'm actually confident that if there is life on Mars, we could bring it back safely. And we're used to dealing with Earth microorganisms that are extremely dangerous, very nasty stuff that we know will cause a problem. And we do that safely on a regular basis.
But Dr. Gilbert Levine is not so sure. He's famous for designing one of the life detection experiments that went to Mars in the 1970s. And he says history shows NASA can't guarantee complete safety. The space agency faced a similar problem in 1969. People then were worried about the astronauts bringing back moon bugs, so quarantine procedures were put in place to stop the moon dust escaping.
When the capsule returned to Earth and the cover was popped, samples of moon dust escaped right then. So the quarantine procedure, while followed, I think mainly for public relations, was never really a scientific quarantine. And I doubt that any kind of contraption that is built for the return of a Mars sample can give us 100% security.
This is the famous Building 37, where Neil Armstrong and his colleagues were quarantined for 3 days when they got back from the moon. Now, the moon turned out to be a sterile place. There were no lunar bugs that would destroy life as we know it. But Mars has the potential to be much more dangerous. Ironically, the building next to 37 was where David McKay discovered the reason he's so keen for NASA to be careful with its sample return. There probably was life on Mars in the past, at least, he says. A few years ago, he found what he claimed were fossilised bugs in a Martian meteorite.
All right, now I've just found some interesting spherical features. They're about 1 micrometer in diameter.
So they could be life?
They could be fossilized life, and they're similar to some of the things that we've seen in other chips of this meteorite.
And in all probability, there are still microbes there now, says McKay. NASA's quarantine job is going to have to be much better than it was for the moon.
In the lunar case, you had the confounding effect of having 3 live heroes whose danger and safety were balanced back and forth in a way that you knew you wanted to get them back alive, against the very unlikely risk that anything was alive on the lunar surface that could cause any kind of problem.
For Mars, Rummel says they're planning to reduce the risk of accidental escape to a 1 in a million chance.
I think that's a foolish probability, 1 in a million, because if there were a 1 in a million chance of contaminating Earth with something dangerous, you would never take it. That's a tremendous high probability. We only have one Earth. Are you going to take a 1 in a million chance of damaging it? People think that a 1 in a million chance is not bad odds. They buy lotteries every day, and those odds are 1 in 100 million, and they spend their money on those.
I think, in fact, that nothing is risk-free, but the risks are very small with respect to bringing back a Mars sample. Having a sample in the laboratory is going to be much more important than I think we even realize now.
Scientifically important, no doubt. But NASA will have to assure the public the risk to us is absolutely minimal.
Airlie Kirkham is an Australian miracle by anyone's standards. And the miracle is that today she can tell you about it.
I used to wriggle my fingers, hoping someone would notice.
This is not Airlie's voice, she can't speak, but they are her words. The story of how she came to write them is a challenge to all the accepted norms of life after coma.
I'm still here. Inside me is Airlie. I have so much to say.
While the hard science of medicine is based on carefully planned trials, control groups and statistics, patients like Airlie can feel shut out of the picture. In this third and final part of our series on coma, we see how individual stories can dramatically challenge the accepted medical wisdom in brain injury and rehabilitation. 9 years ago, at 26, Airlie had a life full of promise. She had a show on the radio.
You have been listening to the Opera Hour on 5UV. I'm Airlie.
Like her mum, she played piano beautifully.
She was a qualified school teacher. She had graduated from an arts degree, a music degree, and a diploma of education.
Until a car accident left her comatose with severe brain trauma in Adelaide Hospital.
So the neurosurgeon was called immediately and gave us his prognosis, which was that he didn't expect her to live.
Airlie cheated death, but when she came out of coma, doctors assumed she was in what's called a vegetative state, not really aware. In fact, she was locked in, able to think but not to communicate. Was this a life worse than death?
It was nearly intolerable. I was sustained by my faith in God and by all the loving people around me, so the answer is no.
Until, amazingly, after 6 years, an occupational therapist noticed a change.
My right arm recovered some movement. I wanted to write my message to tell everyone.
With a prosthesis to hold a pen and with someone holding her hand, at last Airlie could communicate.
Doctors just don't know the final prognosis, and they should not play God.
Doctors can't tell for certain if someone will have an unlikely recovery like Airlie. Yet, as we found earlier in this series, New Zealand doctor Stephen Street believes science tells him enough to know when to switch off life support.
If treatment is to be withdrawn, then I'm going to advocate it should be withdrawn early. And if you view this as sacrificing the miracles, then I can see that that's a viewpoint, but it's not one that I share.
Assessments of coma patients are based on the Glasgow Outcome Scale, a tally of their responses to voice and pain and their ability to move. After her accident, Airlie scored only 6 out of 15, almost guaranteeing that she would not come back to full awareness. If the Glasgow scale was wrong for her, is it wrong for many others?
Perhaps you're missing people who can't make motor responses but are nonetheless aware. And that awareness can be measured by their cortisol secretion.
Clinical psychologist Peter Harrigan set out to find a more objective test of the awareness of a patient in a coma or vegetative state.
The only alternative is a physiological response, and we decided that cortisol might be a good indicator because it is a specific steroid secreted by the body in response to stress, and distress in particular.
Peter Harrigan studied 5 patients whom doctors had judged to be in a persistent vegetative state, that is, awake but not aware. He measured the cortisol levels in their saliva when they were going through activities like hydrotherapy, physio, or listening to a favourite country music song. During a stressful activity, physiotherapy, their cortisol went up.
The physiotherapy apparently was very uncomfortable for them, whereas the hydrotherapy was apparently quite pleasurable for them. And they secreted cortisol at correspondingly higher and higher levels for the physiotherapy.
Next, Peter Harrigan devised a test to see if they could anticipate, a skill we associate with consciousness. The nurses told some patients they were going to have physio in an hour's time. When instead they only played them music, the patients still showed the cortisol stress response.
They secreted cortisol as if they had received physiotherapy. In other words, they anticipated it. It indicated to us that their level of cognition, thinking ability if you like, was far in excess of what was considered to be the norm for people in a persistent vegetative state.
Far from being vegetative, Airlie Kirkham can now write poetry.
Music stirs my soul, uplifts a mournful mood, expresses feelings of the innermost being, compassion, thought, the rhythm of life.
And yet she would not be here if a doctor had removed life support while she was in a coma.
If doctors switch off life support too soon and they all die, they will have very little cases like mine to research.
What I'm talking about is a stage back from that, where it's impossible to know whether the individual that you're dealing with is, if you like, destined to be that well-publicised oddity case, whatever it may be, or are much more likely to be the unpublicised disaster case lurking around in the private hospitals and rest homes and rehab facilities.
But what this series has shown us is that science is still short of certainty when it comes to coma. Though for the severely brain injured, only a few regain a life worth living.
Maybe I'm a guinea pig, but I have proved conclusively that I have a good outcome. I can think and use my brain intelligently. I'm still here.
The remarkable story of Airlie. And that's all we've got for you tonight. Coming up next week on Catalyst, Graham Phillips examines our coastal security.
Bold new technologies like over-the-horizon radar and pilotless aircraft promise to give us excellent surveillance. But critics say even they will leave gaping holes in the net.
We begin an inspiring story of Australians learning to rise above a life of pain. Paul Willis discovers just what it takes to save one little tortoise from extinction.
Back in 1982, there were around 30 of these animals left in the world.
And I'll be back with the latest science news. See you next week on Catalyst.